This is a paid advertisement for Visit the USA. The USA is home to many incredible experiences, from pulsing cities with avant-garde music and art scenes to Michelin-starred restaurants, barbecue joints and microbreweries. But if you're wondering where to start, the team at Visit the USA has these tips on where to find the best music, food and drink. For connoisseurs of brisket, sausage and ribs, one state rises above all others: Texas. The Lone Star State's oldest barbecue joint, Southside Market and Barbecue, has been serving up richly smoked meats since 1882. Next up, the Texan state capital, Austin, nicknamed the live music capital of the world. Whatever you like to listen to, Austin has a venue for you. Head down to its dive bars or out into the hill country for your choice of R&B, disco, soul or country. Tip 3, Western Kentucky, where bigger is always better when it comes to sizzling smoky pulled pork and whole pork shoulders. Cutting through these bold flavours, Kentucky's also one of the nation's foremost bourbon producers, with a history dating back to the 18th century. And finally, why not head west to California, a state suffused with sunshine, sea air and refined good taste. There's more than 100 grape varieties here in rolling green vineyards, where you can try the world-class wines they create. To plan your American adventure, go to visittheusa.co.uk. It's the week ending Friday the 24th of May, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Rishi Sunak calling a general election for July the 4th, a damning report into the infected blood scandal that affected thousands of families, and the death of Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi in a helicopter crash. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from The Week magazine is assistant editor Leaf Arbuthnot, and from The Week's digital team, it's Jamie Timson and the return of OG unwrapper Rebecca Messina, née Gilly. Hey!
Hello, it's so nice to be back.
Rebecca Gilly, as you were before you were married, star of our first ever episode of The Week Unwrapped.
Yes, that is correct, yes. Many, many moons ago. Who'd have thought it could go this long?
Do you remember what you talked about, Rebecca?
Oh, I don't off the top of my head. Wait a minute, though, I do have it because I do have it on here. Okay, well, I've just looked it up, and it turns out we did Was Life Better Before the iPhone? Is online advertising scrambling our brains? And why we should be grateful for Melania Trump.
There we go.
We have to go back and revisit that.
I'd still listen to that. It's evergreen, this content. Who knew it was a current affairs show? Anyway, welcome back to the fold after nearly 5 years away. Rishi Sunak's so scared of you, he's called a general election. And to everyone else, do remember during this election period that we are going to be here for you for respite from the general election. So my pledge to you, all 6 of my steps, is that we will not, on this show, be covering the same slip-ups and broken promises and propaganda victories of the next 6 weeks of the campaigning storm. We will bring you instead the stories you need to know about that everyone else is failing to cover. So please, this is a good opportunity during an election. Tell your friends, come back each week. We are your anti-news agenda news podcast, and you'll never need us more than right bloody now. Okay, Jamie, you are up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
30 years on from apartheid, politics in South Africa is anything but black and white.
Yo, I feel grateful. I'm so happy to see Zuma.
We can see now the real leader is Jacob Zuma.
Some enthusiastic supporters at a political rally in South Africa speaking to Sky News on Sunday. Jamie, who are they so excited about?
They are supporters of Mkhonto weSizwe, for the benefit of me. Primarily, I'm going to refer to as MK from now on.
Political party
in South Africa, and they were talking about Jacob Zuma, who served as the 4th president of South Africa from 2009 to 2018, when he was leader of the ANC.
Yes. So it's his breakout party, is it?
It's his breakout party in South Africa, absolutely. It's named after the ANC's former armed wing from the apartheid years. But this week, he was banned from running in the country's election, which is taking place next week. But it's believed that probably won't stop his new party doing much better than initially expected. He was sentenced to 15 months in prison in 2021 for contempt of court for refusing to testify at a judicial inquiry into government corruption. His lawyers and himself still insist that he should be entitled to become an MP because his sentence was reduced. The constitution in South Africa says that basically if you've been in prison or sentenced to in prison for longer than 12 months, then you can't stand for election. He said that it was reduced by the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, and so they should allow him to. But this week, the country's courts basically said, no, you can't.
Okay, so what's the appeal of him to voters? I mean, many of us will remember him as a successor to Mandela. I mean, obviously that is part of his appeal, I guess. But given that he served time in prison, why is he still appealing to them?
He was actually in Robben Island imprisoned with Mandela, so he's kind of been seen as a kind of successor to him for quite some time. But at the moment, today, he relies on kind of fairly populist policies to attract support, particularly in his home province of KwaZulu-Natal, where he's making gains. I mean, it's a fairly anti-white populism mixed with kind of Zulu tribalism. One of the big kind of talking points over this election is about the constitution, and the MK want to change the constitution, which they say is guided by laws that have come from Europe and not from them, and to a more African constitution. They haven't actually specifically stated what that would look like, but given that South Africa has one of the, perceived to be one of the most liberal and fairest constitutions on the continent, this would be quite a change.
Yes. And Leaf, when it comes to general elections, as we've discovered this week here in the UK, I mean, the Conservatives are referring to Bill Clinton's famous remark, it's the economy, stupid. You know, that's their strategy, isn't it? Look at our numbers, they're going up. What's the economy looking like in South Africa, and what do those numbers suggest about what might happen in the election?
The economy is looking okay / not great. It's predicted to grow by 1% this year, and then about 1% until about 2026. And this follows broadly quite a good picture for South Africa over the past sort of 30 years. In general, in the 2000s, people got quite a bit richer, but living standards have more or less stagnated since sort of 2011 type time. And because inequality in South Africa is so insanely high, it's the highest in the world, whatever growth is felt doesn't necessarily really mean very much to people who are living in poverty, which is a huge proportion of South Africans. So a lot of people will be approaching this forthcoming vote next week as an opportunity to kind of poke the authorities in the eye and just try and get some change whatever happens. And the ANC party has been the kind of dominant party in South African politics since 1994 with the end of apartheid.
What's the current polling looking like, Rebecca?
So at the moment, the ANC is looking forecast to have its fair share of less than 50%, which would mean that it would need to go into coalition with another party. The Democratic Alliance, the main opposition party, is polling around 23%, and MK is around the same as the EFF, which is another radical ANC offshoot. They're both polling at around 10%. Apparently, MK and the EFF are already in talks to possibly form a coalition. So this is going to be something kind of unprecedented in the democratic era if the ANC doesn't get a majority.
What is leading to the decline of the ANC's popularity, Jamie?
I mean, as Leaf was talking, it is kind of living standards is a big issue. There was a kind of massive survey that came out quite recently, and just 29% of South Africans say that their life will get better over the next 5 years. And 79% of respondents say that political leaders cannot be trusted. I mean, for the president, Cyril Ramaphosa, one of the main issues was that he came into power kind of promising that the era of corruption would be over, but then he himself was arrested in 2022 under kind of auspices of corruption issues. This year, South Africa received its lowest ever score on Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, worse than China and Cuba. I mean, really, when we look at the last 30 years, 30 years on from the end of apartheid, democracy has kind of been a game of two halves, really. The first 15 years saw kind of massive improvements in people's lives, but the last 15 years have been like particularly grim. I mean, it will be a massive thing if the ANC lose their majority. They've had the majority for the last 30 years, and obviously everything that's tied up with Nelson Mandela and his legacy, I think this is a final kind of push from the South Africans to say, like, this wasn't what we were promised, really.
But also, the guy's 82, Leaf. And we've talked a lot on this show recently about sort of older leaders, in the context of the USA. When we talk about Africa, we've been talking about actually how there's been some younger blood, people in their 40s and stuff. It's weird, isn't it, that for South Africa, still a country with a relatively young demographic, that might be an appealing prospect, an octogenarian back in charge.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's that sense of familiarity. I think what that survey might vaguely indicate is that South Africans have lost faith in any politicians of whatever age to really change their lives. And so, it might be most comforting just to go for the devil you know rather than the devil you don't.
Which they can't, obviously, because as Jamie said, the news this week is that they actually can't elect him, right?
No, well, exactly. That's true. But the story in the US is quite striking, that when basically parties aren't really functioning properly, they tend to rely on people who have a kind of a track record and who've been in politics for a very long time. And so perhaps age isn't as big a factor as you might expect.
There's also, when we talk about living standards, Rebecca, something else we've discussed on this show in the years since you've been away, which is load shedding in South Africa. It's basically living without power, right? Like organised power cuts for hours every day for a lot of citizens.
Yeah, and this is kind of at the heart of everything, really, because one of the main issues with the South African economy, the reason that unemployment is so high, and it's hovering close to 30%, even higher among under 35s who make up the majority of the population, is not just that there is a skills shortage that does have its roots in the apartheid era and the way the country was structured, but also the private sector that is not large enough to absorb all of these job seekers. And a big part of that is that South Africa isn't an attractive investment opportunity. Obviously, that does create a bit of a vicious circle. And one major factor in that is the power cut issues. This week, Eskom, which is the state-owned energy provider, has claimed that the load shedding problem is solved, considering that there are blackouts on 289 days of 2023. That seems like not necessarily the most convincing claim. They said basically they've been upgrading old infrastructure, but it feels like, well, they could have done that at any point in the past. The timing feels very convenient. Democratic Alliance has accused the ANC of basically leaning on Eskom to keep the lights on in the run-up to the election, and has accused them of basically buying diesel to plug the gaps. They say that this isn't true. They've just done what they were intending to do this whole time. They didn't realise, obviously, when people were living with almost daily blackouts, that the issue was to upgrade all of the ageing infrastructure. A major problem there is that the energy sector in Eskom in particular is controlled by what is essentially a cartel who profit from South Africa's really coal-heavy energy industry. 80% of their energy comes from coal. And there's no comparison to that really in the developed world. And they violently, at times, resist any attempts to modernise, to go green. As you can imagine, they aren't exactly rushing to keep the infrastructure up to date, which was one of the major reasons for the blackout. So very recently, South Africa managed to pass the milestone of 50 days without load shedding. So it does seem like they've certainly done something, but it remains to be seen whether it's a permanent fix or just a sort of pre-election glow up.
Yeah, I mean, Jamie, that energy issue, does that speak to perhaps why MK have been pushing Zuma's closeness to Putin?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the kind of the foreign policy of South Africa has been quite incoherent, I guess would be a good way of describing it. Zuma, the supporters of Zuma have described him as a friend of Putin's, and certainly a lot of South Africans look upon Russia as from the Cold War era and the kind of cross support that they had back then. What's really interesting about what the next stage is, if there is a coalition government, if the polls are correct and they don't get a majority and Ramaphosa has to make alliances with the other parties, it will be interesting to see if foreign policy plays a role in that, even though it's not as big of an issue for South Africa as maybe the energy supplies are. The divide is massive between the Democratic Alliance, which, although it professes it isn't, is primarily a white party and they're the opposition. They're unlikely to go into a coalition with Ramaphosa, or certainly Ramaphosa's ANC supporters are unlikely to support a coalition with the Democratic Alliance. So then you're looking at the two offshoot parties that Rebecca was talking about earlier, either one of those might put quite a high price on any kind of coalition.
I mean, it's amazing, Leaf, in a way, isn't it? Not surprising maybe to South Africans, but perhaps surprising to the rest of us, how much of this politics still is a reaction to apartheid all these years later. That's still, you can really feel the influence of it in all of these conversations we're having.
I know it's the defining thing to have happened to South Africa in recent history, and I'd be interested to find out how much emotional attachment plays a role here. That South Africans are fiercely proud of what happened in 1994, and they still want their politics to reflect that.
Rebecca?
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how well MK does do in the final polls, especially with a lot of it has been predicated on the leadership of Zuma, but now he occupies kind of a sort of Colonel Sanders status within the party. He's the face of it. Everyone associates him with it. His face is literally on the ballot papers next to the party logo, even though his name now won't be on the ballot papers. And without him there, it'll be interesting to see how MK is able to perform.
Yes, although of course Nando's would be a more appropriate fast food allusion for South Africa than KFC. Rebecca, you're up next after this. This is a paid advertisement for Visit the USA. The USA is home to many incredible experiences, from pulsing cities with avant-garde music and art scenes to Michelin-starred restaurants, barbecue joints and microbreweries. But if you're wondering where to start, the team at Visit the USA has these tips on where to find the best music, food and drink. For connoisseurs of brisket, sausage and ribs, one state rises above all others: Texas. The Lone Star State's oldest barbecue joint, Southside Market and Barbecue, has been serving up richly smoked meats since 1882. Next up, the Texan state capital, Austin, nicknamed the live music capital of the world. Whatever you like to listen to, Austin has a venue for you. Head down to its dive bars or out into the hill country for your choice of R&B, disco, soul or country. Tip 3, Western Kentucky, where bigger is always better when it comes to sizzling smoky pulled pork and whole pork shoulders. Cutting through these bold flavours, Kentucky's also one of the nation's foremost bourbon producers, with a history dating back to the 18th century. And finally, why not head west to California, a state suffused with sunshine, sea air, and refined good taste. There's more than 100 grape varieties here in rolling green vineyards, where you can try the world-class wines they create. To plan your American adventure, go to visittheusa.co.uk. Okay, Rebecca, it's your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is the information superhighway rapidly becoming an information B-road?
We will go down in history as the society of the flake wrapping, or the Mars bar. We will be defined by the rubbish that we've left behind rather than the stuff that we have written, because the stuff we have written is increasingly not going to be available to archaeologists. It will only be on the web, and the web will die, or the content of the web will be replaced.
Professor Tim Wilson's video, Is the Internet Dying? How Much Does YouTube Censor?, posted to his channel on Wednesday. Well, Rebecca, let's tackle this head on. Is the internet dying? Really?
Yeah, it's dying, Ollie, and I'm the one to tell you. Well, so the news this week is that the Pew Research Centre has put together a report called When Online Content Disappears, which is about the phenomenon of link rot. So in order to put this report together, they sampled just under 1 million web pages that are currently captured by an Internet Archive, dating from between 2013 and 2023. And they found that 25% of them are no longer live. That rises to 38% of pages that did exist in 2013. And that has ramifications for all our lives.
Link rot.
Yes.
Define.
So this means you click on the link and it takes you either to an error page or it redirects you to the home page. Because
404 with a quirky graphic.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And this is affecting, they looked at Wikipedia specifically as well, because this is Wikipedia obviously being an example of being an encyclopedia with references. Those footnotes then go out to other web pages. They found that 11% of the roughly 1 million external reference links they looked at were broken or error pages, and their analysis then, if you take that on, suggests that more than half of Wikipedia pages contain at least one dead link.
Okay, Leaf, to what extent does this matter? I mean, actually, you're a good person to ask because you're a journalist who spends your days really scanning lots of primary sources to, repurpose and recalibrate what they've said. Does it matter if 10, 20% of links are broken?
I don't think it matters a huge amount, but I do think it matters a bit. It's certainly going to add friction to people's internet experience, and it is frustrating when you click on a link and then it takes you to a sort of dead page. It leads to a sense that the internet is quite full of junk, and that people will want to spend less time on it. That might be frustrating. And also there are problems with archives. You kind of need to keep news stories up, in my view, because they're useful for people who are studying those periods. They're useful in all sorts of ways. And so if news stories in particular are being sort of just taken down, I think that's slightly worrying.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting from the perspective of those news organisations that have already gone online entirely, Jamie. I mean, you think about, there are pages of the BBC magazine that only exist as text on their website. The Independent was a printed newspaper, wasn't it? It is now just online. So if they took those articles down, it's not like there's a paper copy like there would be with The Guardian or The Times to say this is what they wrote 5 years ago. It just doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, and I actually think it's kind of something kind of more existential, really, to worry about. I genuinely do think the internet is less fun and less enjoyable than it was, say, 8 to 10 years ago. I was just thinking about like my favourite internet times that before I came on this podcast, and I was remembering there was this big puddle in Newcastle. Do you remember the big puddle that they like live streamed for an entire day? And the internet just went wild for it because people were trying to get over the puddle, go through the puddle, go round the puddle. And I found a Guardian article about it. I remember being online and being like, this is the best thing I've ever seen. Like, how are these people going to get across this puddle? And one of the quotes from the Guardian article was a guy talking about it. And the quote ends with, God bless the internet. I genuinely think it was a more fun time to be on the internet. And now we're living in a kind of situation where algorithms, Google obviously runs everything. Algorithms favouring fast-loading websites, so people are removing thin content. But even so, it's all being controlled by a handful of companies. What does that mean for, like, our future?
Yeah, I mean, I would take issue with Google obviously run everything. I mean, there are plenty of people using Edge, aren't there? There's plenty of people using Safari. There are other ways to search.
What other search engines do you use, Ollie?
I am a Bing user, but I'm,
You're a Bing user.
I appreciate that's a niche concern. It's got good integration of the AI chatbot. Anyway, Rebecca, back to the issue at hand.
I don't think you should be admitting to being a Bing user on this forum.
The truth is that the internet actually isn't Bing or Google. The internet actually is like a series of apps now, isn't it? There's a generation that have grown up thinking of the internet as a series of walled gardens, some of which they pay to access. And this idea of like archive that Leaf was talking about is something that, people over 20 care about and people under don't even think about.
Yeah, I mean, Ollie, you must be looking at my notes. I'm literally looking at the words walled garden that I'm not going to be able to say now. Thanks for that. I think if you had asked me in 2010, 2012, what are your favourite websites? And in fact, if anyone had asked you guys, I would have said, I don't know, Jezebel, Cracked, loads of websites I used to visit all the time.
Theweek.com.
theweek.com/UK. Obviously my favourite. But if you asked a young person now in their late teens or 20s, what's your favourite website? They would say the name of something that is an app.
Or an influencer even, I follow so-and-so.
Yeah, a TikTok account that belongs to a certain person, And I think a lot of us, certainly if my generation, I'm in my 30s, we were kind of under the impression that the internet would keep getting bigger. And although that might be true in terms of overall content, it's not true of web pages. There were 1.8 billion websites in 2018. That was peak website. And there are just under 1.1 billion today. Furthermore, in 2008, when tracking of this began, 44% of websites were considered active. Today, that's around 18%. So web pages that were seen as, certainly, again, I keep saying for people of my generation, because everything has changed, web pages were seen as the internet, and everything else was just other stuff that's on the internet. But really, that is no longer true.
But aside from journalists, Leaf, why does this matter to everyone else, do you think?
I think it should be a starting gun to download Facebook photos. This is one of my niche concerns, but I really worry that there'll come a time where there'll be some sort of Facebook outage or Instagram, will have some issues. I would like people to download the photos that exist for them basically only online, and ideally print them off and put them in a photo album.
This is music to my ears, Leaf. I have actually. if anyone who works for WH Smith is listening, I know I'm referring all to the trendy brands today, they've stopped making 5x7 slip-in photo albums. You can't buy them anymore. From WH
That's
Smith
outrageous.
online, you can't buy the old one. And when I was 20, I made the calculation that would be a good choice of product to keep my photos in. And I've done it every year since I was 20, and now I still make physical photo albums. I get them printed out, and I've had to buy a photo album from Amazon.
What podcast is this? What have I just what podcast have I just entered into?
Well, if you don't print out your photos, Jamie, Leaf and I are going to be having the last laugh because we'll have our lives documented, and you put it all on iCloud, and someone can just hack in and get a bit of link rot.
Ollie was 20 and decided to start making photo albums, and he was 40 and decided to start using Bing as a search engine. It's just
Good to know you're the same person. I do think it's important, though, because it just feels like all these memories that feel really attainable and kind of permanent to us are actually not. And I think it'd be really tragic if I lost photos of, like, my niece who's a baby. Also, emails and sort of documents they've received by email
I've been
are
on
just
Gmail for
forever.
15 years. Yeah, I don't really own that content, do I?
Nope. You got to be careful. Print out stuff.
That's true, isn't it, Rebecca? If you were really concerned, I want to keep this for posterity, that really is what you should be doing, isn't it? The important stuff, printing it out, because it can disappear. It does belong to a third party.
Yeah, absolutely. And an increasing number of people, we've seen obviously people becoming more interested in vinyls in recent years. And there's been a bit of a resurgence of DVD collections as well, because I think people are becoming conscious of the fact that, everything is really at the whim of the handful of corporations who control most of our access to content. Stuff like you downloaded all of the TV show from Amazon Prime, they decide to remove that from their library and you don't have it anymore, even though you paid for it. And even though you downloaded it, because your download only exists on their server and it can be revoked by them at any point. So there is that question of access to content, but there's also, I think, just the question of the thing that keeps occurring to me is that so much of my formative internet experience was about visiting random web pages, but young people these days won't have that experience of the internet, and it just makes me feel like, certainly when I was young, the internet was like going to a random market, and you'd walk around all the stalls, and some of the stall owners were kind of weird and you wouldn't want to be left alone with them, but they had interesting stuff. The internet now is just supermarkets, right? It's like shiny chain supermarkets.
Westfield.
Yeah, exactly. Everything is curated and presented to you, and you are really strongly discouraged, really, from going outside.
Leave.
One of the things that Rebecca was making me think of is the absolute hell of finding a film that you actually want to watch on all these streaming platforms. I think there's been this illusion that as streaming platforms have kind of multiplied, Disney Plus, Netflix, etc., that our choice is greater than ever. But I found that it's actually really difficult to watch specific films that you'd like to, that, they're just not available on the internet. So I'm not surprised that people are like resorting to DVDs, because I think we've got an illusion of choice online, but actually when it comes down to it, we don't have very much choice at all.
Well, if it all keeps continuing to die, if this 10% becomes 20%, becomes 30%, and link rot sets in on everything, does that really matter, Rebecca, given AI, given smart speakers and the rest, that actually where we're clearly going to be in 10 years' time is talking into thin air, and that's the internet? So what does it matter what a page from 1995 looks like?
I think it may not matter in every circumstance, but I think it has a really noxious impact on notions of authority and transparency and attribution, especially as more and more news organs will be completely online, and a lot of what they're working with then will be links to things that happened online. It's not going to be microfiche that you go and look at the library. There'll be a time when you're talking about things in the past, you're relying on first-person sources that are also digital, and that's just going to keep becoming more true as time goes on. So if those sources are dying away, how do we prove that what happened? The answer is Internet Archive Services, but they are usually non-profits, they're usually run on donations, and it's not at all clear if they're going to be able to survive in the future either.
Okay, we're going to be cranking up the news organ that is Leaf Arbuthnot after this. Leaf, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are you ready for the apocalypse?
Next, let's focus on protein sources that are both lean and long-lasting. Chicken breast fits this as a versatile and lean protein source. It's essentially a ready-to-eat ingredient, making it an absolute boon for those moments when you need a quick source of protein, especially during a long-term disaster situation. Chicken is a familiar taste, and its versatility means it can be used in an array of meals, from salads to soups, or even as a standalone dish. The preservation process used for canned chicken breast ensures it maintains its nutritional value, offering you a long-lasting protein option for your prepper pantry.
Are you stockpiling the right canned food? Prepper's Checklist, a video posted on the Prepper's Almanac YouTube channel on Saturday. Leaf, what do you know that I don't? And should I be getting too much chicken and putting it in my freezer?
I'm not sure about chicken. I think a freezer is not necessarily the ideal thing to prepare for the apocalypse. But maybe you should get some canned tuna. Oliver Dowden, who is the Deputy Prime Minister, has unveiled this week a website which is supposed to help people in the UK prepare for the worst. Oliver Dowden has spoken before about the importance of being kind of ready for disasters. He's taken this up a notch with this website.
Give us the address if link rot hasn't set in.
Yeah, it's prepare.campaign.gov.uk.
Prepare.
And I'm looking at the website right now, and it's quite sort of intimidating looking, because there's a sort of black banner and it says in capitals, "How would you prepare for an emergency?" Emergencies such as flooding, fires, and power cuts can affect us all. There are simple and effective steps you can take to be more prepared.
Okay, so we may have missed the launch of the website. That may be the news story that we all missed. But what's the significance of this? What does it mean? Why have the government, as you say, the Deputy Prime Minister, decided to put this out now?
This is a subject that Oliver Dowden is particularly interested in. I think the experience of the pandemic was quite traumatising for some people in government because basically we were so not prepared for that pandemic. Oliver Dowden is joining a line of Tory MPs and the Prime Minister as well, who have been emphasising the kind of precariousness in which we are all living. Even on Wednesday, when Rishi Sunak announced that there was going to be an election, he doffed his hat to the general state of horror of the world, referencing Putin and the situation in the Middle East. Yeah. And some people are seeing this as a kind of general campaign of trying to make Britons feel less secure in themselves and therefore more likely to trust the Conservatives with their vote at the next general election. That's a really cynical take, but it's hard not to see this announcement from Oliver Dowden not through that lens a little bit.
That's interesting, isn't it, Jamie? I mean, that is a strategy that Conservatives have always used of all different types. You know, if you're worried about security, you're better to vote for us because there are threats coming that we're better equipped to deal with.
I think that's definitely one part of it. I think certainly the focus of the election that we shall not talk about more than just this moment. Having worked in government during the pandemic, I can vouch for what Leaf is saying about how badly prepared we were. One of the things that I think actually the government should be doing more of or looking at is actually the kind of laws and processes of what would happen in the event. So instead of telling us that we need to stock up on frozen chicken or the like perishables,
to be fair, we've taken a clip from an American YouTube channel. That's not what the government's advice is.
Yes, no, sorry. The government.
Let's talk about the government because it is actually, it seems to me like whether they need to issue this advice or not. The advice as it is perfectly reasonable, isn't it? It is canned food, battery-operated torches, battery-operated radio. That makes sense.
Yeah, it's 10 litres of water, though. I don't know where you're going to store. I mean, 10 litres of water is quite a lot. It's 3 days of non-perishable items. It is presupposing that you have big enough flats or living spaces in order to be able to take on all of this stuff. That's one thing. I was going to say about the laws and everything was that, to give an example, when I was working at DFT, we had no laws in place for what happened on the cruise ships. The cruise ships were obviously around the UK and we couldn't allow them to dock basically because we didn't have there wasn't the processes in terms of visas for the people on board. All of that stuff then needed to be kind of legislated on the hoof, as it were. And actually, I think that would be a better way of looking at preparedness, is to make sure that the government is flexible enough in the ways that it works and laws and legislation for a potential apocalypse, rather than putting it on to personal responsibility like it's doing currently.
Yeah, I mean, Rebecca, in the history podcast that you and I co-host with Arian, Today in History with the Retrospectors, we've talked recently about the 1970s preparation for nuclear attack in the UK, which then got kind of published through pressure from the Times newspaper, the Protect and Survive pamphlet and accompanying video, which was ridiculed in the early 80s because people looked at it and were like, this is a ridiculous series of advice that you're telling us to do, hide under the kitchen table, etc. But post-pandemic, it's a bit different, isn't it? The context is different. If you're going to put this advice out so people can see it and the advice needs to exist, Why not do it at a time where people at least understand what can happen if you don't have that advice in place?
Yeah, I think it's about the advice being proportionate to the risk. To what extent can the individual householder take precautions that would effectively mitigate the risk? And I think in this case, floods remain the most likely and most dangerous source of problems for British households, and so it makes sense to take precautions against them. It's small things. It's like knowing where the stopcock is, knowing how to turn off your electricity, knowing how to turn off your gas. So these are all things that everyone should know, because these are things that could really happen. I think the reason that Protect and Survive in the 70s was so ridiculed was because it was trying to tell you how an ordinary person should react in the event of nuclear war. The idea that if you lie down in your bathtub with your hands over your head, that you could survive. That was what was ridiculed. At the time, organisations like the CND opposed the publication because their logic was promoting the idea that you could be okay in the event of a nuclear strike if you just follow the advice was false, and that made nuclear war in itself more likely because people would think of it as being like World War II, just get in your Anderson shelter and it will all blow over in the end. The last major publication on civil defence issued by the government was in 2004. It was called Preparing for Emergencies. Did not mention nuclear war at all, focused on natural disasters, terror attacks, and even the risk of a resurgence of foot and mouth disease, things that I think seem a bit more manageable to the average person.
I suppose the point is, Leaf, this advice, this preparedness has to exist.
Yeah, I'm not against this advice because I do think it's actually fairly important for people to have a website where, they can go if they're worried about these risks. I'm on the website now and I'm looking at the different sort of risks, and some of them sound completely fine, like flooding, we talked about droughts and things. But then, but they also do build up to more extreme situations such as radiation exposure and infectious disease outbreaks. And the advice is quite sort of obvious, but it's not stupid.
You think it might be obvious if you're about to, launch a general election campaign in the rain to bring an umbrella, for example. Preparedness is not always followed through,
I don't know.
is it?
I mean, that was an interesting situation. I don't know why he didn't have an umbrella. Maybe they thought it wouldn't look good in the back of the shot. Not sure. But certainly his suit was so wet that was its own problem. But I don't know. I think that some people will hopefully go on this website and maybe think of getting a can or two of tuna or some baked beans, and that's not such a bad thing. And if they do, if the only danger with prepping hard is that you spend a lot of money on it and it takes up a lot of your mental space, but also the space in your house, and that can cause sort of difficulties at home.
Yeah, well, I suppose it depends on what the circumstances are, doesn't it, Jamie? I'm thinking about those people in Devon who've had substandard water over the past few weeks and have had to be given bottled water by the government. If they'd had bottled water at home, I mean, bottled water isn't good for you after a few years, is it? Like, what if you don't open it or it gets, it's in the sun? There's ways of storing things. It's not as simple as just having it.
I think that's a real issue when we look at kind of preppers or prepping or even like hoarders in general when it comes to food. I think a lot of people now are coloured by their experience of the pandemic. I mean, certainly in America, the huge array of like the clip was saying of people now who are taking up survival courses, the YouTube channels and stuff are down to the fact that they feel like they were let down by the government in response to COVID-19. I kind of am slightly against the idea of prepping and hoarding. My dad, before he died, hoarded a hell of a lot of non-perishable goods and items that we had to get rid of after he died, like full rooms worth of like pasta and tinned stuff and things like that like he was a hoarder, but I don't think he was prepping for a nuclear apocalypse. But anything that kind of pushes you towards this idea of like, oh, actually, I'll just keep hold of this, or I'll just keep hold of this, or I'll just keep hold of this bit, and then it just gets more and more and more. And I genuinely, if you were to ask my stepmom, I think it really affected her mental health from that perspective of having that much stuff in and around you.
Yeah.
So
until, Rebecca, supply chains actually are disrupted and you can't get any toilet roll.
Yeah, absolutely. Although I do think that some of the advice on the Prepare website does show a bit of maybe a willful misunderstanding of human nature. It says 40% of people do not have 3 days supply of non-perishable food and water. So make sure that you have enough tins, etc., in your cupboards to survive 3 days. And some of the coverage has explicitly compared that with, the runs on supermarkets we saw in the early days of the pandemic. But I think that's sort of a misunderstanding of why people act the way they do. I went to the supermarket when lockdowns were announced, not because I didn't have tins in my cupboard, but because I didn't want to eat tins in my cupboard. So obviously I was going to go and buy fresh food because until it's an actual emergency, you're not going to fall back on these things. So I think there is no way to prevent that kind of panic buying without actually legislating against it, which is kind of what we saw in the pandemic. Really, the only effective way to counter the human instinct to grab as much as you can while it's out there is to impose actual limitations on doing that.
And interestingly, Leaf, looking around this website, another thing that they're suggesting we prep for is the internet going down. In relation to our previous story.
Yes.
It's not just
but
about,
you see,
disease.
You and me,
or
Ollie, we will be able to peruse our memories because we would have printed out all those photos and everyone else would be running around like headless chickens. On what Rebecca said, when I went home for the pandemic, there were lots of supplies already at home. So that was quite a vindication of the idea that actually if you do have, say, serious quantities of Costco loo roll, then that means you don't have to go to Costco and join those insane queues. And that was I was a bit humbled by that because I'm a bit of a thrower away. I throw stuff out really easily, and I would say probably too easily. So I think that there's a sort of middle path between the two approaches where, I might have chucked away a coat that I really like and I miss it. And the other kind of Jamie's father, perhaps, the kind of extreme end, that maybe we should be sort of trying to muddle out a path in between the two.
If, Jamie, you could only take one non-perishable item down to your nuclear bunker, what would it be?
It would be a copy of the Week magazine, Ollie.
Good choice.
Good one.
I, of course, would be taking down transcripts of the entire podcast series since we first started with that first episode with Rebecca to keep me entertained. My thanks to Jamie, Leaf and Rebecca. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription when you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Ollie Mann. Our music is by Tom Wilby, the producer, Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.